There was a family in the hills of eastern Kentucky whose skin was blue. Not pale, not tinted, blue. The color of a bruise, of a winter sky at dusk. Doctors who saw them for the first time sometimes stopped talking mid-sentence. For almost 200 years they lived along a creek called Troublesome, and the world explained them with a story, a romantic story, a French orphan, a rare gene, a wilderness marriage. You have probably heard some version of it. It isn't true. And when genealogists finally sat down with the actual records, the census pages, the birth years, the marriage bonds, the real story turned out to be stranger, sadder, and far more human than the legend anyone bothered to check. To understand it, you have to go somewhere the roads did not want to take you. Eastern Kentucky, Perry County. Steep wooded ridges folded into each other like knuckles. Hollows so narrow the sun only visits for a few hours a day. Creeks with names people gave them out of exhaustion. Troublesome Creek, Ball Creek. In the 1800s, getting from one hollow to the next meant a day on foot or a mule, and getting out of the mountains entirely meant something closer to a decision about your whole life. Nobody built a railroad in there for generations. And that single fact, the absence of a road, is the quiet engine of everything that follows. Because when people cannot leave, they marry the people who are already there. Around the middle of the 1800s, a man named Martin Fugate settled in Perry County and married a woman named Elizabeth Smith. By every account, they were unremarkable. Hill people, farmers, the kind of family that shows up in a census ledger as a line of names and ages and nothing else. They had 9 children. 4 of them were blue. Sit with that for a second. Not sickly, not struggling to breathe. Blue, and otherwise perfectly healthy. Children who ran and worked and grew old. One of them lived past 90. The neighbors did what neighbors do. They talked. And over the decades, as the Fugates married the Combses and the Richies and the Stacys, because who else was there, the blue kept surfacing. A blue baby here, a blue cousin there, sometimes skipping a generation entirely and then reappearing in a grandchild, like something the family could not put down. By the 20th century, the blue people of Troublesome Creek were a legend in Kentucky and an embarrassment in their own homes. And this is the part the legend always skips, what it actually cost them. They were stared at in town, children were kept home, families stopped going to church, stopped going to the doctor, stopped going anywhere they might be looked at twice. Some of them married into the same few families precisely because those families would not flinch. The isolation that created the blue also became the only place the blue could live in peace. There are accounts of Blue Fugates who were ashamed their whole lives, who covered their hands, who would not be photographed, a whole family carrying a color like a secret, and nobody, not one doctor, for over a century, could tell them why. That changed because of a woman who would not let it go. In the 1950s, a nurse named Ruth Pendergrass was working at a clinic in eastern Kentucky when a woman walked in asking for a blood test. The woman was, in the nurse's own telling, blue as a damson plum. Pendergrass thought she was watching someone die in front of her. The woman was not dying. She had walked in from her farm. Pendergrass could not forget it. And years later, when a young hematologist named Madison Cawein came through the region, she told him about the blue people up the creek. Cawein, to his enormous credit, did not laugh. He went looking. He drove into the hollows. He knocked on doors. He got the doors closed on him, more than once. Because a stranger with a medical bag asking about your skin was not a welcome sight in a family that had spent generations being gawked at. He kept going back. Eventually he sat in a kitchen with 2 members of the family, a brother and sister, and drew their blood. And when he looked at it, he saw the thing that broke the case open. Their blood was brown, not dark red. Brown, chocolate brown, and it stayed brown even when he shook the vial with air, which normal blood will not do. Normal blood turns bright red the second oxygen touches it. Cawein had read something, a report from 1960 by a doctor named E.M. Scott, describing the same impossible brown blood among Alaska natives, thousands of miles away, in another isolated population. And Scott had the answer. The enzyme, diaphorase. Here is what it does. Your red blood cells carry hemoglobin, and hemoglobin carries oxygen. But a small amount of your hemoglobin constantly converts into a useless form called methemoglobin, which cannot carry oxygen at all. It's brown. In a normal body, an enzyme called diaphorase mops that up continuously, converting it back, keeping the level under 1%. You never notice. The Fugates were born with almost no diaphorase. So the methemoglobin built up. Their blood ran brown instead of red, and brown blood under fair Appalachian skin doesn't look brown. It looks blue. It was a recessive trait, which means you need 2 copies, one from each parent, to turn blue. 1 copy and you're a carrier, ordinary looking, passing it quietly to your children. In a normal town, 2 carriers almost never find each other. The odds are absurd. In a hollow with no road out, where the same dozen families married each other for 150 years, the odds became a certainty. And then Cawein did something that sounds like folklore and isn't. He treated them with a dye. Methylene blue, a common blue dye that happens to give the blood an alternate chemical pathway to convert methemoglobin back to normal. He injected it, and within minutes, in front of him, the blue drained out of their skin. Blue dye, curing blue people. A man watched a woman's lifelong color leave her body in the time it takes to boil coffee. They gave the family methylene blue tablets to take. Cawein published in 1964, and the mystery of Troublesome Creek was, as far as the world was concerned, closed. The bluest of them all was a woman named Luna Fugate, born 1886. People who knew her did not reach for metaphors carefully. They said she was blue all over, that she was the bluest woman they ever saw. She married a Stacy, had 13 children, and lived to 77 years old, dying in 1964, the very year Cawein published the answer she never needed, because Luna was, by every account, entirely healthy, blue and fine. That is the strange dignity at the center of this. The condition was almost purely cosmetic. What harmed them was never the methemoglobin. It was being looked at. And in 1975, in a hospital in Hazard, a boy named Benjamin Stacy was born, so blue the doctors nearly rushed him into a transfusion. His grandmother stopped them. She had seen this before. She told them about the blue people up the creek, and she was right. Within weeks, his color faded to almost nothing, and he grew up ordinary, blue only in his lips and fingernails when he got cold or angry. He was the last one. The roads had come, the hollows had opened, young people married outside the county, and the genes scattered back into the general population, where 2 carriers would probably never find each other again. The blue people of Kentucky simply stopped happening. That was the ending everybody accepted. A rare gene, a French orphan who carried it into the mountains in 1820, an isolated valley, a doctor with a blue dye, a story with a bow on it. Except a genealogist went and checked. In 2025, researchers doing the unglamorous work, pulling the actual census records, the actual birth years, the actual marriage documents, found that the famous story does not survive contact with the paperwork. Start with the orphan. There is no evidence Martin Fugate was French. There is no evidence he was an orphan. He was born in Russell County, Virginia, and his family had been in Virginia for generations, walking the same ordinary migration path across the Appalachians that thousands of other families walked. The word orphan wasn't a fact. It was genealogist shorthand for, we don't know who his parents were, an admission of ignorance. And somewhere along the way, it hardened into a nationality, a tragedy, and an origin myth. Now look at the date. 1820. Every version of this story says that's when Martin Fugate arrived in Kentucky. It isn't. 1820 is roughly when he was born. The most famous date in the legend is not an arrival. It's a birth year, misread and repeated for a century until it became a boat. And then the biggest one. The story says it all began with one couple, one carrier who married another carrier, one accident of fate. There were 2. Martin Fugate married Elizabeth Smith, and Martin's second cousin, a man named Zachariah Fugate, married Mary Smith, Elizabeth's sister. 2 Fugate cousins married 2 Smith sisters, and both couples had blue children, which tells you something the single orphan story cannot. The gene was not imported by one stranger. It was already there, running down the Fugate line and the Smith line, independently, waiting. The researchers call the mechanism pedigree collapse. It means that in a closed population, your family tree stops branching outward and starts folding back into itself. The same ancestors appear in your tree over and over, from different directions. Luna, the bluest woman anyone ever saw, descended from those shared ancestors through 3 separate paths at the same time, 3 roads back to the same door. She wasn't blue because of one French orphan. She was blue because her family tree was a knot, and the legend has a tell, a place where it breaks its own arithmetic. The oral history claimed that Martin's son Zachariah married his aunt, Mary Smith. But Martin's son Zachariah was born in 1871, and Mary Smith was born around 1820. The story had a man marrying a woman born 50 years before him. It was 2 different Zachariahs, generations apart, collapsed into one person by memory. The family tree wasn't the only thing folding in on itself, so was the story. So why did we need the orphan? I think because the truth is uncomfortable in a way the legend isn't. A French stranger carrying a rare gene into the wilderness is exotic. It's nobody's fault, it happens to you. Cousins marrying cousins for 150 years because the roads didn't reach them. That's not exotic. That's poverty. That's a country that built railroads to the places worth reaching and left the rest to fold in on themselves. The blue skin wasn't a curse carried in by an outsider. It was a mirror. And we've done this before. We told the Lumbee they must be the lost colony of Roanoke, because a vanished English colony was a more comfortable answer than a mixed people who built themselves out of the wreckage. Same instinct. When the real story implicates us, we import a romantic one. The Fugates were never a curiosity. They were a family that stayed in one place because leaving cost more than they had, and the mountains kept them, and the mountains marked them. They farmed. They raised children. They lived long, healthy lives in a color that hurt nobody and cost them everything, because of how they were looked at. The mystery of the blue people of Kentucky was never why they were blue. It was why we needed them to be a fairy tale. If somewhere back in your own family there's a story that feels a little too neat, a mysterious foreigner, a lost heir, a tidy explanation nobody ever checked, go pull the records. The truth is usually less romantic, and usually it's about people who stayed.